In the winter of 1938, the mountains of Asturias held a secret that even the fiercest storms could not bury. Somewhere between the frozen peaks and the shadowed valleys, there existed a family whose story had been deliberately erased from history. Until now, you were never meant to hear about them. A bloodline so insular, so meticulously preserved, that its very existence whispers of obsession, manipulation, and forbidden design. The Calderón sisters, Alina, Magdalena, and Esperanza, were more than siblings. They were instruments in a dark symphony of genetic control, orchestrated by a father whose obsession with purity blurred the lines of morality, law, and humanity itself. Imagine a world where a single man, isolated from the eyes of society, dictates the lives of his children with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a general. Aurelio Calderón had traced his lineage for decades, studying ancient records, marriage logs, and birth certificates, each page a testament to a family convinced of its own superiority. He called it la pureza de sangre, the purity of blood. But purity, when enforced, becomes tyranny, and tyranny breeds secrets that fester in silence. The sisters were raised in isolation, their education, their beliefs, even their perception of love filtered through their father's vision of a sacred lineage. They spoke a language of the past, mixed with fragments of Latin and archaic dialects, preserving culture not for art, but for control. They wore garments woven by generations, not for fashion, but as a symbol of separation from the common world. And then came the solution a husband shared between three sisters. A man whose identity was carefully disguised. A mechanism to concentrate the bloodline further, in ways that would be considered monstrous by ordinary standards. By the time an American war correspondent stumbled upon the valley in 1938, he found not just a family, but a machine of obsession, spinning through decades with calculated coldness. The mountains had swallowed their screams, their silences, their complicity, and yet buried within the snow and stone, the truth awaited exposure, a story that could unravel the very fabric of what you thought you knew about humanity, loyalty, and corruption. This is not folklore. This is not legend. This is the record of a deliberate, morally unthinkable design, hidden in plain sight, ignored by governments and sealed by fear. And now, I am revealing it to you. Prepare yourself. What you are about to hear will disturb your understanding of family control, and the lengths humans will go to impose their vision of perfection on the innocent. The Calderón sisters were not raised like ordinary children. They were raised as vessels, carefully molded by a man who believed the world outside the valley was irredeemably corrupt. Aurelio Calderón's obsession with blood purity was not a passing fixation, it was a doctrine. It's a sacred law etched into every corner of their stone farmhouse. Each lesson, each word, each story was a tool to shape obedience, to normalize the impossible. Alina, the eldest, absorbed these teachings with precision, her mind sharpening under the weight of responsibility. Magdalena, softer and questioning, learned quickly that curiosity beyond the valley's boundaries was dangerous, a moral flaw punishable by the silent authority of her father's gaze. Esperanza, youngest and perceptive, sensed the growing horror before she fully understood it. She knew that the lines between love, loyalty, and control had been deliberately blurred, and that escape was not just difficult, it was unimaginable. Isolation amplified their obedience. The valley was a cage hidden in plain sight. The mountains themselves became walls, snow-laden and impassable in winter, cutting the family off from towns, strangers, and anyone who might challenge Aurelio's authority. Communication with the outside world was non-existent, except for carefully curated letters that reinforced the narrative he wanted them to internalize. Over the years, he fed them a story of divine destiny, of Gothic kings and noble ancestry, convincing them that they were not ordinary humans, but carriers of a sacred mission. Every meal, every ritual, every small chore was imbued with the purpose of preserving their bloodline, a lesson in control, disguised as tradition. And then he introduced the plan. the ultimate act of control, Rodrigo Calderón. A man presented as a distant cousin would serve as the vessel through which the sisters would fulfill their sacred duty. What the girls did not know, and what Rodrigo himself had been manipulated into believing, was the truth of his identity. Their union was not just a marriage. It was a calculated experiment in isolation and genetic concentration, orchestrated with meticulous precision. Each rotation, each period of companionship, was a ritualized step in a decades-long design. As winter tightened its grip on the valley, the sisters began to adapt, not fully understanding the horror of what was unfolding. They were educated, yes, but only to understand the family lineage, the purity of names, the significance of blood. Everything else, the outside world, normal childhood, social bonds, was stripped away. Their minds became maps of obsession, their hearts vessels of compliance. And while most families would have fractured under such pressure, the Calderón sisters became a mirror of their father's will, precise, controlled, and chillingly united in their isolation. You are not witnessing mere history. You are witnessing the mechanics of psychological domination, the kind of knowledge that once seen changes the way you view obedience, loyalty, and the darkness humans can cultivate in the name of ideals. The first day, Rodrigo stepped into the Calderón Valley. The air itself seemed to change. The snow crunched beneath his boots like a herald of something forbidden. His eyes, dark and calculating, scanned the stone farmhouse as if he already knew its secrets. And in some ways, he did. Aurelio had prepared him for this moment for years, shaping his understanding of duty, of blood, of obedience. Rodrigo arrived not as a man, but as a mechanism, a living instrument designed to execute the father's vision. Alina, the eldest, met him first. Her sharp gray eyes, reflecting the obsession that had been cultivated in her since birth, measured him instantly not as a man, but as the key to preserving generations. She understood immediately the weight of responsibility, the ritualized duty her father had assigned her. Magdalena, ever hesitant, recoiled slightly at the calculated precision of Rodrigo's demeanor. She sensed something was wrong, a depth to his understanding that went beyond the narrative her father had spun. Esperanza, youngest, felt a chill that wasn't entirely caused by the mountain winds. There was something in Rodrigo's presence, something that aligned disturbingly with Aurelio's vision, yet hinted at a darker truth, one she was not yet ready to face. The rotation began. Elena's month with Rodrigo was methodical, ritualized. Every movement designed to preserve the illusion of duty while obscuring the grotesque mechanics behind it. The sisters' lives became a calculated dance, choreographed by a man who had removed all chance of deviation. Each night, Alina pored over genealogical charts, imagining the children yet unborn as perfect embodiments of La Persida Sangri, oblivious or unwilling to acknowledge the human cost of this obsession. Magdalena's unease grew as she watched the mechanical precision of her sister's behavior. She asked questions, small, tentative inquiries about Rodrigo's origins, the family history, but was met with calculated deflection, the subtle but unmistakable force of Aurelio's authority pressing down upon her like an iron weight. Rodrigo himself was more than compliant. He was invested. Years of manipulation had ensured that he believed in the sacred duty of the family, and his eyes often reflected a disturbing intimacy with the plans he had been drawn into. The sisters learned almost instinctively to anticipate his moods, his rhythms, the pattern of his presence in the house. Silence became their language, compliance, their survival, and behind every measured glance, every chore performed in quiet precision. The machinery of control ground onward, producing the next generation in secrecy, obedience, and the shadow of horror. By the end of the first rotation, the family was irrevocably changed. What had begun as a bizarre arrangement of convenience had started to manifest as psychological entrapment. Elena's mind sharpened into obsession, Magdalena's into fear and confusion, and Esperanza's into acute awareness of the horror hidden beneath the surface of familial duty. You, watching this unfold, are now closer to understanding the invisible chains that control human behavior. This is not simply a story of forbidden acts. It is a study in the deliberate shaping of minds. It's a quiet tyranny that masquerades as tradition, and the first step down a rabbit hole from which there is no return. The truth, when it began to surface, arrived not as a whisper, but as a cold, shattering realization. Esperanza discovered it first, a set of letters hidden beneath her father's mattress. Carefully concealed, decades old, and yet alive with the intent to manipulate. Each envelope she opened revealed not affection or guidance, but calculation, control, and deception on a scale that defied comprehension. The man cycling through rotations with her sisters was not a distant cousin, as Aurelio had claimed. He was the son of a secret union, a child of the family itself, sent away to grow ignorant of his origins. Rodrigo was, in every moral sense, both outsider and kin, a living embodiment of his father's twisted obsession with purity and dominance. The psychological impact was instantaneous. Esperanza's hands trembled as she read. The firelight flickering across the walls of the stone farmhouse, illuminating faces of ancestors who had never existed outside her father's obsession. Her mind, honed by years of control and isolation, now grappled with the enormity of what had been orchestrated. It was not merely a breach of social or religious taboos, it was the deliberate engineering of human lives. A concentration of genetics, loyalty, and obedience distilled into a single, horrifying experiment. The sisters, unaware of the full truth, continued their rotations, their behaviors subtly shifting under the weight of unseen forces. Alina, ever meticulous, grew more secretive. Her attention consumed by charts and genealogies, by projections and probabilities of the children yet unborn. Magdalena, increasingly uneasy, began asking questions that were met with strategic silence or outright anger. And Rodrigo, the man at the center of this engineered chaos, displayed a calculated intensity that suggested he knew far more than he let on. His eyes, dark and unreadable, reflected the echo of years spent as a tool of manipulation, a pawn in a scheme centuries in the making. Isolation had amplified the machinery of control. Every gesture, every thought, every small act of curiosity outside the prescribed roles was suppressed not by threat of violence alone, but by the carefully nurtured belief that deviation was sacrilege. The sisters had been conditioned to see their father's plan as sacred, to mistake the horror of incestuous design for divine duty. And in this valley, far from the scrutiny of society, the normal rules of morality were suspended. You, listening now, are peering into the mechanics of control, how a single mind can dominate generations, how secrecy amplifies horror, and how the human capacity for obedience can be weaponized. This knowledge is dangerous, not because it is fiction, but because it is true. And once you understand it, there is no turning back. You see, the Calderón sisters were not merely victims, they were collaborators in a system designed to shape them, body and soul, for a purpose they were never meant to question. By the autumn of 1897, the fruits of Aurelio Calderón's design began to appear. Alina gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, while Magdalena brought forth a single daughter. Esperanza, still painfully aware of the web of deception surrounding them, watched as the carefully orchestrated experiment transitioned from theory into flesh and blood. These children were unlike any other. Their very existence a testament to centuries of obsession, secrecy, and manipulation. From their earliest days, signs of the consequences became evident. All three bore the distinctive gray eyes of the Calderón bloodline. Yet their physical features hinted at the unnatural concentration of genetics. Alonso, the eldest twin, had a pronounced underbite that made even simple words difficult to pronounce. Conchine, delicate and quiet, displayed webbed fingers, a grotesque echo of her father's rigid ideals. Carmen, Magdalena's daughter, appeared more normal at first glance, but her hearing was severely limited, forcing the family to develop intricate hand signals to communicate. Even the smallest details, the curve of a jaw, the texture of skin, the angles of limbs spoke of deliberate design, a precision both horrifying and inspiring. But the horror was not merely physical. Their behavior, shaped by years of indoctrination and isolation, revealed a precocious awareness that went far beyond their age. By 3, the children displayed a fascination with genealogy, lineage, and the roles they were destined to fulfill. Play, imagination, and childhood innocence were replaced by charts, names, and dates, each child instinctively understanding that their purpose was to serve the family's sacred design. They whispered among themselves with a secrecy that unnerved Esperanza, as though they already knew they were part of something forbidden, something dangerous, something that the outside world would never accept. Rodrigo continued his rotations, his presence a constant reinforcement of the system. The sisters, now mothers, as well as participants in Aurelio's plan, adapted, their minds sharpened by obsession and fear. Silence became a tool, compliance, a survival mechanism. Even the routine of feeding, bathing, and teaching was imbued with the ritual of bloodline preservation. The valley itself seemed to absorb the weight of this unnatural order. The mountains, the snow, the cold winds, they became witnesses to a horror that existed beyond human comprehension, a secret maintained for decades, impervious to intrusion. And yet, as the children grew, their unique characteristics began to attract attention, even if only in subtle ways among those who might one day stumble upon the truth. Halfway through this story, if you feel the pull of understanding, write in the comments, "I see the truth," then write it again. Let it anchor you. Let it mark the point where you step beyond curiosity into awareness. Because what follows is no longer just a story. It is an initiation into the mechanics of obsession, control, and the terrifying consequences of unchallenged power. As the first generation of Calderón children grew, the valley transformed into something unnatural, a breeding ground not only for genetics, but for obedience, secrecy, and ritualized horror. Alonso, Kamshin, and Carmen were no longer mere children. They were instruments carefully guided toward a destiny crafted by a father who saw morality as a variable and purity as absolute. Every glance, every whispered conversation, every chore and duty was a lesson in submission, a reinforcement of the rules that Aurelio had designed to isolate, control, and manipulate. By the early 1900s, Aurelio's health began to wane, yet his obsession intensified. The urgency to cement the second generation of Calderons became all-consuming. He trained his grandchildren not just to understand genealogy, but to participate in its perpetuation. Every child was measured, analyzed, and cataloged. Their physical traits, behaviors, and even quirks meticulously recorded. Obedience was rewarded. Hesitation, curiosity, or deviation was punished not with violence alone, but with the slow, corrosive power of psychological pressure. They were taught that the outside world was corrupt, weak, and undeserving of the truth. And in that twisted pedagogy, the children internalized a worldview that made the horrific seem sacred. Rodrigo continued his rotations with the sisters, and now the children observed. They watched, learned, and even calculated alongside their parents. By the time they reached adolescence, they were participating in discussions about the preservation of bloodlines, projecting potential offspring qualities, and absorbing the logic that their existence, no matter how unnatural, was ordained. Esperanza, increasingly aware of the immorality of the system, realized that her influence could only document, not prevent. Every attempt at resistance collided with the years of conditioning that bound them all together. Isolation remained absolute. Education outside the valley was forbidden. Medical care, social exposure, even entertainment, everything ordinary children took for granted was replaced with rigid instruction in genealogy, language, and obedience. The valley itself became an extension of Aurelio's will, the stone walls and snowbound mountains acting as silent enforcers. There was no escape, only deeper immersion into a system designed to perpetuate control across generations. By this stage, the Calderón household was a microcosm of absolute authority, a laboratory of obsession. The children, molded to serve a purpose they barely understood, were complicit in their own confinement, and in that complicity lay the true horror. You are watching the architecture of domination unfold. How control, when applied with precision and secrecy, can shape minds, bodies, and the very perception of reality. What you see here is not myth. It is a blueprint for human manipulation at its most calculated. A mechanism that once understood cannot be unseen. By the second decade of the 20th century, the Calderón family had become something other than human in the eyes of the outside world. A living experiment. Meticulously hidden, its participants unaware of the magnitude of what had been orchestrated. The first generation of children, now adolescents, exhibited behaviors that unnerved even the most stoic observer. They were hyper-aware of hierarchy, of genealogy, of blood. Play and innocence were foreign to them. Their conversations revolved around lineage, probability, and duty. They were mirrors of their father's obsession, taught to see life through the lens of genetic purity rather than emotion or morality. The second generation began to arrive, children born under the same controlled rotations that had shaped their parents. Physical anomalies multiplied, subtle and disturbing. Webbed fingers, distinctive gray eyes, angular features that reflected the intensity of the concentrated bloodline. But it was not only the body that revealed the consequences, it was the mind. The children were intelligent beyond their years, yes, but their intellect was weaponized. They understood patterns of obedience, deception, and manipulation before they could understand friendship or empathy. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered secret reinforced the system that had ensnared them from birth. Rodrigo, now older and fully immersed in the calculated rhythm of his duties, functioned as both participant and enforcer. He executed Aurelio's designs with precision, ensuring the rotations continued without deviation, reinforcing the idea that their purpose was sacred. The sisters, mothers, and daughters, simultaneously, were now complicit architects of a cycle that perpetuated itself in secrecy and isolation. Esperanza watched with increasing horror, recording the unfolding events in journals, the only conscious act of resistance she could manage. Her awareness was both a burden and a weapon, an attempt to witness truth before it was buried forever. Isolation had deepened, but so had control. Every child knew instinctively to obey, to hide curiosity, to internalize the values of a system that had replaced morality with duty. The mountains surrounding the valley became sentinels of secrecy. The snowfall, a barrier against discovery. The family existed in a self-contained world, where deviation was impossible and awareness of the outside world was systematically erased. And yet, within this meticulously constructed horror, there was a seed of something far more dangerous: understanding. The children, keenly perceptive and highly intelligent, began to recognize patterns, to question motives, to see the manipulation that bound them. What Aurelio thought would produce perfection, instead created awareness, an awareness that, when fully realized, could unravel the entire system. You, watching now, are witnessing a convergence of power, control, and forbidden knowledge. What unfolds next is the culmination of decades of obsession and the moment when secrecy begins to crack. By the 1920s, the veneer of control that Aurelio had spent decades constructing began to show fissures. The children of the Calderón family, molded by isolation and indoctrination, were no longer passive instruments. They were becoming aware, perceptive, and dangerously curious. Alonso, now a young man, displayed a restless intelligence that Aurelio could neither fully suppress nor predict. His gray eyes, mirrors of the obsession that had birthed him, began to reflect a growing recognition that the rules, the rituals, the sacred duty imposed upon him and his siblings were constructs designed to control, not to elevate. Kamshin and Carmen, too, began to question. Their obedience had been absolute. Their compliance near perfect, but subtle defiance began to emerge in whispered conversations, in stolen glances at forbidden texts, in quiet explorations beyond the farmhouse walls when snow and duty allowed. The carefully orchestrated rotations with Rodrigo, once executed like clockwork, The man who had been introduced as a distant cousin and was in reality the product of Aurelio's own twisted logic was both enforcer and manipulated participant. His own understanding of the system had evolved. The lines between obedience and complicity blurred, and the horror of their shared secret weighed on him with increasing intensity. Esperanza, ever the observer, began to document every nuance with meticulous precision. Her journals became a ledger of corruption, psychological manipulation, and the grotesque evolution of a family-turned laboratory. She recorded subtle changes in behavior, the emergence of cruelty under the guise of duty, and the way that indoctrination had created a generation capable of rationalizing acts that no ordinary mind could condone. Her awareness was isolating. She knew she alone fully comprehended the depth of the machinery around her. Yet the valley itself seemed to conspire with the family's growing unease. The mountains, once silent sentinels, became oppressive walls that reflected the intensifying psychological tension. Every sound, every shadow, every crack in the stone farmhouse seemed amplified, reinforcing the sense of surveillance, control, and imminent discovery. The family was beginning to understand that even perfection comes at a cost. And now, as you watch, you are on the precipice of witnessing not just the story of a cursed bloodline, but the anatomy of control itself. If you feel the weight of understanding, anchor it. In the comments, write, "I see the truth," then write it again. Let it mark the moment you acknowledge the machinery of manipulation, the hidden forces shaping lives, and the moral abyss that awaits those who dare look too closely. Because from here, there is no turning back. By the late 1920s, the Calderón Valley had become a crucible of unnatural perfection and terrifying dysfunction. The second generation of children, born under meticulously controlled rotations, exhibited the physical and psychological consequences of generations of concentrated bloodlines. Angular faces, webbed fingers, unusual skeletal structures, and the ever-present gray eyes marked them as distinct, almost otherworldly. But the true horror was not in their appearance. It was in the sharpness of their minds, the eerie precision of their instincts, and the way they had internalized their father's doctrine of duty above all else. Alonzo, Conchine, and Carmen, now mentors to their younger siblings, became enforcers of the same twisted logic that had shaped them. They taught compliance as though it were virtue, secrecy as though it were honor, and the suppression of natural instinct as though it were divine command. Every deviation from the system, every flicker of curiosity, was met with a subtle but relentless pressure to conform. The younger children grew hyper-aware of their roles, the rotations, and the careful calculations of their father and elder siblings. What might have been normal childhood rebellion became a dangerous, almost impossible act. The entire household had been transformed into a living, breathing organism, every mind and body functioning in service of an obsessive, unyielding ideal. Rodrigo, now older and carrying the weight of decades of compliance, oscillated between awareness and participation. He understood the horror of the system, yet his mind had been so meticulously molded that he could not conceive of defiance without existential terror. The sisters, mothers, and enforcers themselves exhibited a strange duality, reverence for the ideal and despair at the human cost. Esperanza, alone in her full comprehension of the deception, continued her secret journals, recording horrors that would stagger anyone unprepared to confront them. The valley itself seemed complicit, a silent witness to the unraveling of morality. Snow-capped peaks, treacherous passes, and the isolation imposed by nature itself reinforced the control Aurelio had cultivated. And yet, as the children matured, subtle cracks appeared. Moments of hesitation, flickers of doubt, and whispered questions began to seep through the disciplined exterior. The seeds of awareness, once planted, were difficult to eradicate entirely, even in a system designed with such ruthless precision. What you are witnessing is more than a story. It is the anatomy of obsession, the consequences of absolute control, and the terrifying reach of a single mind over generations. It is the kind of knowledge that changes perception, awakens awareness, forces recognition of forces at work beneath the surface of ordinary life. The Calderón lineage, meticulously engineered, now stands as a cautionary monument to human ambition, secrecy, and the dark potential of obedience unchecked. By the Lineages, the Calderón experiment had reached its apex. Generations of isolation, obedience, and deliberate genetic manipulation had created a family unlike any other, distinct, intelligent, and disturbingly aware of their own uniqueness. The valley had become a microcosm of obsession, a monument to the consequences of control and secrecy. Every child, every adult, every interaction was a reflection of decades of meticulous planning. What had begun as an act of devotion to bloodline purity had become something far darker, a machine of human behavior, self-perpetuating and nearly impossible to disrupt. Esperanza, the lone witness to the truth, understood the full scope of the horror. She recorded it all in journals, preserving what the outside world could never comprehend: the rotations, the physical anomalies, the psychological conditioning, the obedience masquerading as virtue. She understood that the consequences extended beyond the valley, beyond Spain, beyond history itself. Aurelio's vision had created a lineage that could influence, control, and manipulate far beyond its walls. The implications were terrifying. When obsession is combined with intelligence, secrecy, and opportunity, it transcends ordinary morality. Rodrigo and the sisters, complicit yet trapped, continued the cycle. They had been shaped so profoundly by obedience and indoctrination that rebellion was unimaginable. The children, now coming of age, demonstrated the chilling efficiency of the system. Intellect, awareness, and compliance fused into a singular, horrifying entity. The purity Aurelio had worshipped had become a cage, a psychological labyrinth where love, morality, and freedom were all carefully subverted. This story, hidden for decades, reminds us of the invisible forces that shape human behavior: control, secrecy, manipulation, and obsession. The Calderón sisters and their descendants were not monsters born of chance. They were engineered by a mind that understood the full power of fear, influence, and isolation. The valley, the snow, the stone farmhouse, they were silent witnesses to a truth the world was never meant to see. And now, having witnessed this, you carry a responsibility. Knowledge changes perception, awareness alters understanding, and some truths once seen cannot be unseen. Reflect on the power of control, the fragility of morality, and the dangers of blind obedience. Share what you have learned, carry it with vigilance, and recognize the forces at play, not just in history, but in your own world. If this story has touched you, reshaped your perception, and awakened something within, remember, you are no longer an observer. You're a part of the continuum of awareness. Comment below your recognition of truth, your acknowledgement that you have seen beyond the veil. Let it be the mark of transformation, the step toward understanding the dark mechanisms that quietly govern lives, families, and entire societies. Because some knowledge once revealed changes a man forever.